Well, welcome to our historic Miamisburg series here. It's the Bicentennial series, and the reason we chose the Bicentennial series is that in 4 years, Miamisburg will be celebrating its anniversary of 2,000 years. So we will have, this is the first, and we feel like we're doing this on the Miami-Erie Canal, which is so appropriate because it was in the mid-1800s that flourished here in the area. So I'm Carol O'Connell, and my guest here is David Neuhardt, who is the expert on the Erie Canal. And we're into part 2. We already have done 1 part, and there's just so much to tell about it that we've decided to go on with the 2nd part. David is currently president of the Yellow Springs Historical Society, and he's also a corporate attorney. Working attorney, right?
That's right, that's right. That's why I'm dressed like an attorney today.
That's all right. But we left off when you were showing us the dam at West Carrollton.
That's right, and we were discussing the fact that a group of Miamisburg businessmen, right after the Civil War, decided to harness the power of the river to operate factories in Miamisburg, and the way they did that was they dammed the river at West Carrollton, and I think we have a photograph showing that, yeah, here we see it now. They built a canal that carried the water from the dam, from behind where it was backed up behind the dam, around the bend, that big bend where the river makes in West Carrollton, to the main Miami-Erie Canal at the south end of West Carrollton, where the water emptied into the main canal, and the main canal was used as just a carrier for all this excess water. It was actually enlarged so that it could carry the extra water, and it just took it as far as the north end of Miamisburg, where it was used in factories. And where this view is shown here today is Hydraulic Road, and the reason it got its name, Hydraulic Road in West Carrollton, is because of that hydraulic canal, and hydraulic just means water power, or used for water power. We also have a photograph that shows the Miamisburg. Well, maybe we could see Dixie Highway first. If we could see Dixie, so this is the section coming down along the Dixie Highway. This is late in the canal era, and one of the problems with water is you either had too much or not enough. And so they had to have an adequate supply, so even in the dry seasons they had plenty of water coming down, but they also had too much at times.
Where would that be?
And this would have been between West Carrollton and closer to Miamisburg, actually. And this is called a wasteway, and the wasteway worked just like the overflow drain in your bathtub. When the water reached a certain height, it ran over this reinforced area of the bank and ran down, in this case, under Dixie Highway and over to the river, and where it would have dumped into the river. So this was extra water, excess water, where the canal was up higher than it was supposed to be, and it would run off the edge, in essence, and go under the canal, or excuse me, under the highway and into the river. So the water is coming down to Miamisburg. We also have a photograph of the Miamisburg Aqueduct. It's a historical photograph, and that shows one of the mills. Actually, there in the background here was, I believe it was Groby's Sash Works. And so it would have been a factory that used saws to cut up lumber into fittings for a house or a building. And it used water that was sold to them. They would actually rent the water rights from the Miamisburg and Carrollton hydraulic company that built that dam, and they would take the water out of the canal and run it through the mills and their turbines and create power, and then they dump the excess water out into, in this case, Sycamore Creek.
Well, isn't that how all of them did it then? The water, like the mills, all of the mills did that?
That's right. You had to have a drop in the elevation in the mill to run the mills, mill wheels originally, but then turbines in later days, and so that's what happened here. It ran out at the canal level and then down through the mill, and then exited a lower level into the creek. But the other thing we can see in that picture, if we can see it again, is really interesting because in the foreground here you see these walls, and those walls are actually a structure we'll see from the side in a minute that was an aqueduct, because the question was, what happens when your canal got to a stream and you had to cross the stream? Well, if you just tried to cross the stream, all the water would run out. So they built what were called aqueducts to carry the stream across the canal across another stream. And again, these go back to Roman times. Here's a side view today of what that exact same spot looks like, and you can see behind the pipe that's using the same space now, the concrete box that the canal went across was designed to carry 4 feet of water, because that's how deep the canal was, and a boat would have just gone across that concrete trough. Now, interestingly, here you see stone abutments on either side, and that's because before this concrete structure there was a timber structure, and in fact before the timber structure there was a culvert, which was a rounded stone arch that would have carried the canal over. In fact, we've got a great story from the 1880s when lots of ice was being shipped from north of here down to Cincinnati for the breweries, because they just had a huge demand for ice, and it seems odd to think about something as slow as a canal boat carrying ice, but they did, and sometimes they would ship daily during the summer ice that had been kept from the winter in ice houses and loaded into the canal boats, probably packed with sawdust. And in any event, in the 1880s, when a boat full of ice was going across that in a storm, the stone culvert washed out, and the boat and the mules and the crew all ended up in the bottom of the creek, because the boat was going across it as it washed out, and they replaced that culvert then with the aqueduct you can see today.
Well, the one you just showed us there of the Sycamore, that's
yes,
still there. I mean,
that is
if
still there. That is,
in our area,
anybody wants to see it, it's right next to the on Sycamore Creek, right next to the village or the city garage.
Yes.
And so it's
if you would take 4th Street north, you would run to a dead end, and then the levee would be right there. You would see it.
And you just walk up on top of the levee and take a look. Here's a view of it from a distance. Now, this is interesting. The reason why it has a connection with that hydraulic canal is that the hydraulic canal, those mills, at the paper mills in particular, at the north end of Miamisburg, used that water from the Carrollton Dam up until the 1940s. And so while the rest of the canal was abandoned, that was still being used, that section between West Carrollton and Miamisburg, to carry water to those paper mills. And once whatever was left over after it ran through the mills, they had gates or doors on the side of the aqueduct that they built that they could open up and just let the excess water out into Sycamore Creek. And that's exactly what you see in the distance. In the background there is one of those gates is open on the right, and you can just see the water pouring out.
Yes,
So at this point, this picture was probably taken after it was no longer being used for canal transportation purposes, but it was still carrying the water to those mills. It was still serving an important purpose. But you know, the canals weren't only used for work, for transportation or for power. They were also used for fun. And I think we've got a photograph, maybe we can see that if it's not X-rated.
They went swimming.
Yeah, this is showing one of these.
Ah, there they are.
Here's this particular view of some boys skinny dipping in the Miami and Erie Canal was actually, it's a postcard. It was taken in Middletown, so fairly close to here. But that swimming in the canal, I'm not sure the health department today would approve of it, because there was all sorts of nasty things in that water, but back in those days it didn't matter.
That's right. But they threw a lot of junk into it.
They threw a lot of junk into it. But not only used it for swimming, there was some fishing in it. There was also, in the winter when it would freeze over, used for ice skating, and you read accounts of people taking ice skating parties basically up the canal. I know one account I recall was people leaving Lockland in northern Cincinnati and skating all the way up to Hamilton or Middletown on the canal when it was frozen in the winter, because it was only 4 feet deep, so it would freeze pretty easily.
Yes,
Yeah. So so it was fun too. People would take canal boat rides for picnics, and school groups would Sunday afternoon excursions. So it's all lots of use, more than just the hard-working canal that it started out to be.
Didn't kids jump on the canal boats and then ride to the next lock or something, and then jump off?
Yeah, and they try to hide from the captain and make sure the captain, if they got a nasty captain, he'd throw them off into the water. There's a book that was published in the 1920s by one of the newspapers in Cincinnati. It's called Playmates of the Towpath, and a columnist in the Times-Star at the time sought stories from different people who remembered the canal, because in the 1920s it was being formally shut down because it was no longer operating. And he said that anybody who had ever seen the canal, walked across the canal, fell in the canal, or swam in the canal, story was welcome. And so it's a book full of those kinds of stories, and tells lots of things like kids riding on the boats.
Is that book still around? I know some people would find that interesting.
It's a great book. It's probably the library has it. It was reprinted maybe 10 or 15 years ago, so you can still find copies on the internet occasionally, but it's a great book. Lots of good stories and photographs of this whole area.
Well, talking about the boats on the canal then, they weren't that wide, so I mean the boats, but the canal wasn't. So if you have one going north and one south, and you only have one towpath, so how did you let the other boat pass you?
Sure, and the boats were not more than 15 feet wide, because they had to be able to get through those locks, which were 15 feet wide and 90 feet long. So your boat had to be smaller than that, or you never could have gotten it into a lock. And so that governed the size. And so two boats could pass physically. I mean, there was enough space for two abreast the canal, because it was 40 feet wide across the top, and it was the standard dimension for it. But so how do you got mules, and you've got ropes, and you've got a towpath only on one side of the canal. How did you get past? Well, it was a system where one boat, the boat that was going to allow the other boat to pass, would steer, and these were steerable boats. I mean, they had a steersman on the back with a rudder, and he would move it as he was making headway, move it over to the far side, called the berm bank was what the far side was called, and his mules would move to the outside of the towpath, and they'd let their tow rope just go slack and go into the water. And that would allow the other team, the boat would go over that tow rope that was down in the water, and its mules would walk across the rope that was laying there slack, and that's how they crossed. Now that was in theory, and in theory it was the boat that was going upstream, so going north in this area, that had the right-of-way. And also there were some rules about the faster boat had the right-of-way. Well, there's lots of stories about judgment calls about who was going faster or who had the right-of-way, and I don't know how many of the stories are true, but lots of fights breaking out over who had the right-of-way, who got to a lock first and got to get through it, and so at least in the early days of fighting going on. But the way the boats operated really changed over time. In the early days, there would have been a crew of at least five people: a captain, a steersman who's operating the rudder, a bowsman to sort of help the boat into the locks when it came up to the locks and make sure it was going in the right direction, somebody to herd the mules or walk behind the mules, and a cook. You had to have a cook, and so that was a crew of 5 people. But in later days, it was more of a catch-as-catch-can system, because families would operate boats. There wasn't a lot of money into it, so you didn't have companies operating often. And so very often it was just a family would own the boat. It was a family boat. They would live on the boat. Maybe they would dock in the wintertime and get work. The father would get work in town, and the kids could go to school. But the rest of the time they were out on the canal carrying whatever cargoes they could get. And often the kids were the ones who were the mule tenders and walking the towpath with the mules to make sure they kept going and kept pulling. So
at the time, though, you know, I think it was just so innovative, everything. But let's go back to the construction of the canal.
Okay, sure.
I mean, we didn't have backhoes and
this was,
all that stuff.
One of the most amazing things to me after reading and studying the canals is that when they got done, they actually worked. Because when you think about it, they're building something hundreds of miles long without the fancy surveying equipment we have today, and without
no blueprints.
No blueprints. No, in fact, they had surveyors that would go out and they called locate the canal, and they just came up with sort of a general idea of about where it was going to be, but none of the specifics. And then the contractors would come in and actually build the canal. And they, you know, this was virgin forest in a lot of cases, so they had to first take the timber off, which was a lot of work, and then they had to dig the trench, and it had to be gradually going uphill all the way from Cincinnati to Shelby County, where it hit the summit, and then it had to go gradually down the other slope. And so getting it to work and hold water and not get places where the water sat and didn't run and that sort of thing. And there was just a little teeny bit of a current in the canal. So it took a lot of work to lay it out. And then the actual back-breaking work of digging
all by hand.
All by hand. Shovels and horse-drawn scrapers was about all they had. And it was amazing here to see it built. But there was a place up in north of here called the Deep Cut, where they had to excavate 50 feet down into the clay to get the canal across a high spot. And that took years, literally, of digging. And a lot of the digging was done by Irish immigrants, German immigrants. Sometimes some local farmers would take on a section or work on the canal in order to get some cash money. In fact, there was a little bit of a labor shortage when the canals were first built, because the state was building the canals and they were building the national road, and there just wasn't a lot of extra labor. But there are sections of the canal that they say an Irishman died every mile of canal, and they might
be buried there.
And they might well be buried.
Excavate now, we might find something.
They might be buried there. They were served whiskey, particularly if they were working in what they called wet work, where there was a swamp or they were actually having to be in the water. It was a hard existence.
Well, I'm sure they died of malaria and
lots of disease. There were cholera outbreaks during part of the canal building era when construction just stopped. So it was a tough thing to.
And they got paid how much?
They got paid, depending on the kind of work they did, maybe a dollar or two a week, I think, is what their pay was. Maybe $10 or $11 a month, maybe. And they would only get paid from when they were actually working. So if the weather was bad, and they really couldn't work for one reason or another, they wouldn't get paid.
So what'd they do in the winter then?
Well,
they couldn't dig very well.
Well, they dug as long as they could, and then they'd have to find something else to do. And there's a great book. I wish I could remember the name of the author, but called Seed of the Fire, and it's about an Irish immigrant family working on the Ohio Canal, the other canal that was on the eastern part of the state. And it's a novel, but it's got a lot of history woven into it, and it's just a great story of that. So I'd suggest that anybody who's really interested in that part of the history, that'd be a great book to read.
But then, it was quite a feat, I think, to be able to put that together with no engineering, no degree in engineering or anything. That's right.
Well, they couldn't even find, when they were first laying the canals out or doing the surveying, they couldn't find an engineer in the whole state. They had to send to the Erie Canal for an engineer in order to even, things were fairly primitive early on, but Ohio, by the time it was done, built almost 1,000 miles of canal in different parts of the state.
And we really thrived during that time. There were jobs for people, right. And then the goods ran through. And then what happened to the decline? Well,
the decline came, and it's interesting to see a graph because the high point of the canals from a revenue standpoint, bringing in revenues more than what it cost to maintain them, was in the early 1850s. So really they hadn't operated very long. If you think this opened in 1828, but in the early 1850s the tolls reached their highest level, and then all of a sudden, as you see the mileage of railroads in the state going up in the 1850s, the revenues on the canal went just the other direction, because all of a sudden there was another cheap form of transportation that was even faster, a lot faster than the canal. Yes. And so the canal scrambled. The state, by the 1860s, wanted out of the business of operating canals, and they leased the canals to a group of men who operated them for about 10 years and then defaulted under their contract, under their lease, because they weren't making money either, and the condition was getting worse and worse. So the state took them back in the 1870s, and they hobbled through the 1880s. And then at the turn of the century, there was a resurgence of the canals all of a sudden, because, interestingly enough, there was a group that decided that they could electrify the canals and have electric tow engines that would pull. I don't know if we have a photograph that shows this or not, but
the electric mule.
The electric mule, yeah, the electric mule was what it was sometimes referred to. But the little tow motors that the idea was they could pull 8 or 10 boats with this one electric motor, and they had trolley lines, and the trolley lines were put in all the way from Cincinnati to Dayton, so through Miamisburg. But the actual operating, and tracks were built that far too, but the actual operation really stopped in Middletown, and they went bankrupt, so they didn't make it.
They were kind of competing with the railroad there then, weren't they?
They were competing, well, and in fact that was the idea, because the state didn't like, the legislators didn't like the fact that the railroads had almost monopolies and could raise their rates. Oh. So they thought, well, if we rejuvenate the canals, it'll be a competition for the railroads and keep the railroad rates under control. So it was almost less a matter of really wanting the canals to operate and more this threat to the railroads. And that's why the state started appropriating money about 1900 to completely rebuild the system. With those concrete locks we saw photographs of, and concrete structures, and they never really quite got it done. And then 1913 happened.
Oh, that just wiped it all out.
That wiped it out because.
Well, see here though, they filled it in, and they call that the cinder path.
Yeah,
because
that's right.
When they went to get everything out, though, they tell me there was all kind of stuff in there. People just dumped everything. Well, and that's a bridge they're showing.
And that's a bridge in Miamisburg, and you can see it was a lift bridge. Those wheels on the top had cables, and would actually lift. This was a later bridge, would lift that deck up so that the boats could go under it. But this was after the 1913 flood, and you can just see what a mess it was. Then, and it had become more or less of an eyesore. You know, the famous John Patterson in Dayton started NCR and had really gotten his start in a coal yard along the canal, turned totally against the canal, and he built a dock at NCR that he said, well, no boats ever came and brought any cargo, so obviously the canal should be discontinued. There's no reason for it. And he put money into a campaign, the Anti-Canal Society, to have the canal closed in this area. And in fact, you know, fitting or not, Patterson Boulevard today, named after him, is on the route of the canal. Powerful, right? Is on the route of the canal through Dayton. So
well, that's why Old River was called Old River, because not the canal, but the river actually, Miami River came through there.
That's right. The canal
changed the course.
Actually, the canal went through there, and the river sort of brushed against the canal right there. It was supposed to be the hardest construction on the canal in the entire original 66 miles from Dayton, from Cincinnati to Dayton. But yeah, that meandering of the river, they decided that contributed to the flooding. So after the 1913 flood, they put that nice big sweep in by Carolyn Park and relocated the river, and Old River was what was left.
But there, you speak of Caroline there is a lock there.
There is a lock there, and interestingly, that lock is a stone lock. It's not a concrete lock. It's located in the canal. It's in the Miami and Erie Canal, but that's not where it was originally.
Oh, they moved it there.
It was originally built in what's now Huber Heights in Wayne Township, and in the 1940s, as they were developing Carolyn Park, they moved the lock, took it stone by stone apart, numbered it, and rebuilt it in the canal, but in miles from where it originally was located. So that's interesting. Although there are two other locks that was part of a three-lock grouping in Huber Heights, and there's a small Huber Heights park where one of the other locks is located, and it's worth seeing if you're up in that area.
Well, there's that one there, and then there's the one in Tip City. And
there's one in Tip City, and there's the Sunfish Lock we talked about
yes.
in the first session. So there's a lot to see in this
there
area.
Is. Well, we'd love to have you do a tour again. I did take David's tour, and I was just so amazed at the expanse of it and what we still have preserved.
Yeah, and it may not be as much as some places, but we've got a little bit of everything. Because
and there's a lot of interest in the area. Yeah. We have an association, don't we, that keeps it going?
And I'm a member, an officer of the Canal Society of Ohio, which has about 300 members statewide, and we do 2 tours a year of different sections of the canal. Although my wife kids me and says, yeah, here we are looking at where something used to be and isn't there anymore. But we enjoy it. We have a great time. It's a great way to see different parts of the state.
Well, this has been wonderful, and we just have a few seconds. Is there anything you would like to see happen to that now that is not happening?
I think we need to make sure we're preserving and educating to the public to the history of the remaining artifacts. There aren't a lot of them. You know, Miami Township did a great thing with Sunfish Lock. I don't think that the Sycamore Creek Aqueduct is recognized for what it is. Could be a great place for a historical marker. There's a canal boat warehouse downtown Dayton, and maybe we can see that photograph as an end thing here. It's called the St. Louis of Dayton. It shows a freight boat. There we go. In downtown, right across from the public library. This is sitting on what's today Patterson Boulevard, and that building behind it, the freight warehouse, is still standing, and also a really significant place.
Well, this was great. Thank you so much.
We made it through.